So, as many of you may know, Ambassador Guy Saint-Jacques was Canada's ambassador to Beijing from 2012 to 2016. And in September 2013, Ambassador visited Tibet, met with the government officials to talk about developments in Tibet, including human rights and religious rights in Tibet. And in this context, I would like to invite Ambassador to talk about his experience of visiting Tibet and in general, the work of diplomats in Beijing.
Thank you very much, Mr. Tershin, for the invitation, and good afternoon to everyone. Bonjour tout le monde. I have had 3 postings to Beijing from 1984 to 1987, the second time from 95 to 99, and finally, as we have just heard, as ambassador from 2012 to 2016. And I had never been able to go to Tibet during my first 2 postings. I would say that for diplomats, access to Tibet is very restricted, but it has always been a subject of attention on the part of the embassy. And usually we have always one officer that is charged with following issues. Sometimes there's more than one officer to cover various angles. And of course, what was of interest was and remains of interest, I'm sure, is our questions like religious freedom, indoctrination, forced labor, and so on. By way of background, also, when I arrived in Beijing in October 2012 as ambassador, I went to meet with other colleagues to introduce myself and to exchange views. And I recall when I met with the British ambassador, he said, explained to me that your prime minister, at the time the prime minister was Mr. Harper, met with the Dalai Lama, and you kind of got scolded, but he said, my prime minister, Mr. Cameron, met with the Dalai Lama, and the Chinese have cut all ministerial visits and have imposed sanctions on the UK. And I said, well, there is one important reason to explain this. And you will recall that at the time, there was a Chinese company, CNOOC, that wanted to buy Nexen, an oil and gas company from Alberta. And the Chinese knew that if they wanted to impose sanctions on Canada, that the immediate reaction of Prime Minister Harper would have been to say, forget about buying Nexen. And the purchase of Nexen had become a case of national prestige for China, and this was going to be the largest acquisition abroad, and so they were very eager. And I mentioned this because for most Western governments, when you deal with China, Tibet is one of the red lines. And by red lines, the Chinese include in this Tibet, Xinjiang. Now they try to include Hong Kong and all the issues that they consider internal. They don't want any foreign interference. But I can tell you that, throughout my career, the situation and human rights in Tibet have been raised by ministers, by prime ministers. And so, and the work of the embassy, we try to follow developments in Tibet, but it's very difficult to do that because visits are very restricted, and Also, we tried to go to minority areas in Gansu province and Sichuan, where there are large Tibetan communities, to try to get information about their situation. You know, is there, are they free to practice Tibetan Buddhism and that sort of thing. And when we had a development assistance program, it was, and that program that was run by the Canadian International Development Agency ran for about 30 years. It stopped in 2014. There have been projects in Tibet which allowed some people, some of the embassy officers dealing with development assistance to travel to be there. We also had for many years a small fund at the embassy that we called the Canada Fund that allowed officers to visit Tibet. I recall there was one very successful project, in my view, that was launched by a Canadian Jesuit. He had built a bakery where he was teaching blind children how to become bakers. But there had been a few other projects. And so all this to say that there's always lots of interest for what's going on in Tibet and in peripheral areas. And so when I arrived in Beijing in October 2012, right away I asked to go to visit Tibet. And I knew that, and I wanted to put the request because I knew that it could take some time before I was allowed to go there. And again, you know, China sees this as a very sensitive issue. But eventually, in the spring of 2013, there were obviously internal discussions, and at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the division that deals with Canada, which is called the MEDASA, the North American and Oceania division, is responsible for countries in Oceania, but also United States, Australia, New Zealand, and Canada. And the word came out that the ambassadors of these 4 countries would be allowed to visit Tibet one after the other. And so in the spring and early summer, my colleagues, my American, British, not British, American, Australian, and New Zealand ambassador went one after the other. And I was told that I would be the last of the 4. I don't know why the order was like that, and maybe it was because of past positions taken by Canada. And so I was told that I would be allowed to go, I think it was in late June. And so we bought air tickets, but then administratively, it's always very complicated because you have to go to Chengdu, and then from Chengdu, you have to take a plane to go to Lhasa. And you need an official authorization permit to be able to get on the plane in Chengdu. And so we made all the reservation, the air reservation, the hotel reservation in Chengdu, the hotel reservation in Lhasa. And at the last minute, literally the last minute, we were scheduled to leave, and the night before, well, we didn't get this piece of paper, and so we had to cancel everything. And the Minister of Foreign Affairs had no explanation for this, and so I wrote a very angry letter, and I explained that this was unjustified. It could not be explained. I protested, and I said why was not allowed to go to Tibet, and we have suffered economic losses for this. And by the way, your ambassador in Canada has no restriction on places that he can visit. And if you don't indicate when I will be able to go to Tibet, I will recommend to Ottawa that limits be put on trips are taken by your ambassador. And also in Ottawa, at the time, the department contacted the Chinese embassy to protest also against this last-minute cancellation. And so then during the summer, the word came that I would be allowed to go to Tibet in September. And so we started again the process. And of course, these visits to Tibet are heavily choreographed. I had put a number of requests of people that I wanted to see, people that I wanted to meet. And I was told, well, you will have your program once you arrive in Lhasa. And so we made all the reservation, and we got to Chengdu, and we went to the airport. We had received this permit to authorize us to go. In fact, I went with, we were a few people from the embassy. We were, my wife came with me, and 2 officers of the embassy came as well. And so we got this official permission. And then when we were at the airport, we went to get in Chengdu, we went to get our boarding passes, and they said that someone had come to pick the boarding passes for us, and then therefore they said, well, you won't be allowed to take the plane because you don't have your boarding passes. And we said, well, who took the boarding passes? Why were they given to them? And so it was another fight, and finally we the boarding passes were retrieved. So we got on the plane, and it was an evening flight. And as we were getting to Lhasa, and we were starting to prepare for landing, and we're about 10 minutes away, the pilot said, the weather is not good in Lhasa, we have to go back to Chengdu. And so I said to myself, is this possible that they don't want me to go to Lhasa, and they use this kind of excuse? So we turned around and we landed in Chengdu at 1 o'clock in the morning. And it was another fight for, with China, Air China, to find a hotel. They put us in, I would say, a 1-star hotel. And they said, be back at the airport at, we got to the hotel at about 2 o'clock, and they said, be back at the airport at 6 because the plane will take off early. And so that's what we did. And finally, the plane took off, and we arrived early in the morning. And, we asked if we could go to the hotel to rest for a few hours and delay the start of the official program. And they said, no, you have to start. But when you are a diplomat, you have to deal with jet lag. And so I said, okay, let's go to the meetings. And the program was this way. We had, I think, 2 days of meetings in Lhasa. Official meetings, visit of monasteries, and then we went by road to Shigatse, where there were other official meetings, and then drive back to Lhasa. And the meeting, the first meeting in Lhasa was with the vice chair of the government of Tibet, and as expected, it was a meeting where this official outlined all the developments that had taken place in Tibet, with the emphasis on economic growth and this, and of course, I asked very specific questions about religious practice, whether religious practice was allowed, what was the state of play for Tibetans in terms of economic opportunities, in terms of health questions, and so on. And I would say it was a difficult conversation because they were on the defensive, and according to them, everything was fine, and Tibetans were pleased, to leave their nomad way of life and to move into homes that were built in villages, and to participate in economic activities. So I would say that for, basically, I knew that the meeting went as I was expecting, but it gave me an opportunity to explain our position, our concerns about the situation in Tibet. And I said that I would hope that my visit would help me to understand better the situation. But I also said that we had expectations that the Chinese government would relax its policies on Tibet. And so we had a few official meetings. We went also to visit a few monasteries. Again, and for the visit to the monasteries, we had to pay our own way, but I didn't mind this. And so, but it was very interesting because when we sat down with officials from the monasteries, I would ask questions, and the Tibetan monks would turn to the officials to see whether they could answer the question, and we're always waiting to get the green light. And we had tried to schedule 2 meetings on our own in Lhasa. One with a university professor that was working on a project, and we had given a small grant. And the idea was to see whether quinoa could be grown in Tibet, because it's grown in South America at about a similar altitude. And we wanted I just wanted to have a general discussion to see how the experience was going. And we had contacted this person directly. But then what happened to this professor, security people visited him the day before our arrival and said, you will be sick tomorrow. You won't meet with the Canadian ambassador. So obviously they had listened to all the conversation. The same thing for the other meeting that we had tried to schedule. The person was told, you're sick. And there was a third person that we didn't try to, it was a Tibetan lady who was active on social media. And I don't recall her name, but I knew that if I wanted to meet with her, this could create problems for her. And so I didn't try to contact her. And this person, often would make comments on the social media that were critical of the Chinese government, but because she was alone and she was not trying to organize a movement, her criticism were tolerated. This stopped, I think, the year after, because there was a crackdown and they didn't want anyone to put any criticism of the regime. In her case, what happened is that security people went to her apartment in Lhasa and said, and stayed in front of her apartment and said, "You are not leaving for the next 24 hours." Despite the fact that, we had not phoned her to try to organize a meeting. And so this shows the level of scrutiny that is applied. And of course, when I knew that our phones, the conversations were listened to, but it was a confirmation that you cannot outsmart the security people. They pay special attention to what's happening in Tibet. And so in terms of the program, we then went by car to Shigatse, and of course, Tibet is a beautiful country with very nice countryside, very nice scenery. And the officials with us would point out as we would proceed with our journey, all the villages that had been built with the houses. And it was harvesting time. I saw people harvesting barley. And so we got to Shigatse, where it was a bit a similar program, official meeting, and a visit to the monastery. Again, in the official discussions, very difficult because I pointed out examples of things that we had learned. I asked questions, specific questions about some people, because also at the embassy we try to maintain a list of Tibetans who we knew had been detained or harassed. And I mentioned earlier this project that had been created by a Canadian Jesuit to help blind children to learn some skills, and he had set up the schools with a bakery. That we were allowed to visit that project. And because I insisted, and because we had given money, and I said it's a fellow Canadian, and so we were able to see that that project. And so then we drove back to Lhasa, and they took us to a carpet factory that was producing Tibetan rugs, and we bought a few. And then we went back. We said to our minders, "Thank you very much. We are tired. We will now rest." And so once they were gone, we quickly walked to downtown Lhasa. It was just about a 20-minute walk. Another thing that happened with the hotel, they said, "You will go to this hotel," and we said we wanted to go to another hotel, and they didn't want that. So what they did, they contacted the other hotel, and they said, "If you give rooms to the Canadian ambassador and his group, we will shut down electricity to the hotel." And so we had no choice but to go to and I gathered that they wanted that because, of course, they had wired, in the end, they put all the 4 ambassadors in the same hotel, And they had installed, I'm sure, the microphones and all the gear, so they they didn't want to have to install other equipment in the other hotel. And but when we walked by ourselves downtown, and we went to have dinner. And after dinner, we noticed that there were large groups of Tibetans walking around one of the temples, the main temple in Lhasa. And so we joined the people, and there was a lady, and I started to speak to her in Mandarin, and she replied she was with her 2 children. And I asked her, I said, well, what's going on? And she said, well, Tibetans like to come every evening to pray, and we circle the temple, and we pray. And she was from a small village, so I was able to get more information from real people. I stopped also in a store, and I spoke with the owner of the store. I had learned how to say hello in Tibetan, and so I said this, and he started to speak to me in Tibetan, and I replied in Mandarin. I said, "I'm sorry, I told you all the Tibetan I know." So, and he said, "Who are you?" And I said, "Well, I am the Canadian ambassador." Oh, he said, "That must explain why there has been so much security around in Lhasa." And so. But I had a conversation, asked him how business was, who was coming to. He was selling hats, and I asked him, how was business. And so that evening, we had a sense that we had a bit more of an opportunity to speak with ordinary Tibetans, but I don't know how our handlers felt about this, but I didn't care too much. And so all this to say that it was a short visit that was mostly choreographed. The visit also to the monasteries, they tried to make them as short as possible. I went to one of the monasteries. In fact, when we drove back from Shigatse, we went to one of the monastery where monks debate among themselves. And I said, well, why are so few monks around? And they said, well, it's a holiday. And I said, well, which holiday? And after 20 minutes, they said, okay, the visit is over. You go back to your hotel. And I said, wait a second. I paid for this visit. If you want to leave, leave. I'm staying here. And they said, I'm going to this part of the temple. And they said, well, it's closed. I said, well, there are tourists there. And I just went there. But it was very frustrating to try to get information and to engage in a dialogue. I should mention also that I had another opportunity to discuss with the situation in Tibet when a Tibetan who was member of the government in Tibet went on a visit to Canada, and on the way back stopped in Beijing, and I had dinner with him. But again, very little came out of that. He was giving the party line and all this. So I would say that, my impression coming out of Tibet is that the Chinese, there were lots of Han people. Han people are encouraged to move to Tibet to work there, to open factories, and there are various incentives to convince them to go. It's very difficult for Tibetans to, in my view, to benefit from economic opportunities. Many Tibetans, in any case, would prefer to continue with their traditional way of life, but the government is putting in place measures to try to stop that and to park them into villages. And yes, there's lots of construction with, they were very proud to show us the train that was being built between Lhasa and Shigatse. But so overall, I would say, this was my experience in Tibet. And I would say it remains very difficult for diplomats to have a good feeling for what really is going on in Tibet. But we knew that there were programs in place to try to indoctrinate Tibetans, to limit the practice of religion, and trying to impose all kinds of controls. And very often what I heard from Chinese officials, they were angry that Tibetans were not more grateful for the economic progress that China has brought to Tibet. And so I'll stop here, and I'll be happy to try to answer your questions.
I muted myself. Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you so much for sharing this. I think the fact that restriction was applied for such a high level of diplomats really confirms that there's something that China is trying to hide. Otherwise, there wouldn't be a reason to restrict such visits. So with this, I would like to invite our participants to ask questions. We'll try to give opportunity to everyone to ask a question. So if does anyone want to volunteer and ask question first? Any questions?
Maybe I could.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sure. Please.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. The last time I was in Tibet was 2003, and sadly, it sounds like your experience. I mean, I'm not an ambassador. I was, so I could, lay low behind the scenes, and but it sounds, like even the narrative of being disappointed that Tibetans aren't more appreciative of, like these ungrateful natives. That narrative has been the narrative for decades. It's the with COVID, I wonder if I assume, and I just don't know if you have more to add to it. I'm assuming that the pandemic has been an opportunity for the Chinese authorities to further repress. Very little news is coming out through underground, in any way, officially or unofficially, from Tibet, and no news is never good news with Tibet. So, but I wonder if you have further sort of insights or ideas about what might be at play, or I don't even know what I'm asking, but further insights. Yeah.
Well, I would say, I think you're right. I think, COVID provided a great excuse to the Chinese regime to prevent people from going to Tibet, and from Tibetans also to go outside. In fact, that reminds me also that when in one of these conversations, they were talking about a skill program that where they were sending Tibetans outside of Tibet to learn skills, and it was supposedly to help them to then be able to benefit economically. And I said, well, why don't you provide that training here in Tibet? And there was no explanation. And also, I said, why don't you allow foreign correspondents that were based in China to visit Tibet and let them go around? If you do such a great job, why don't you let them go and speak with Tibetans and go to monasteries and watch? Well, they said, thank you for your comments, but obviously it's something that they were not willing to entertain.
Next, we have Spencer Julian from SFT Canada. Yes, Spencer.
Hey, Ambassador. Thanks so much for spending the time with us this afternoon. I'm just wondering, it sounds like during your time in Beijing that, the Canadian Embassy was very actively monitoring the situation, and I suspect that continues to be the case. But I'm wondering how back here in Canada you see the best path forward to kind of using our leverage to hold China accountable and renew that Sino-Tibetan dialogue. What do you see as the best path forward for Canada being a leader in renewing that dialogue and in advocating for human rights in Tibet? And how can we make that a kind of a common kind of dinner table question again?
Mm-hmm. Well, it's not. It's a difficult question, and especially right now with the relationship being so bad between Canada and China. And it's always, I would say, when I recall when the various countries started to have human rights dialogues in the 80s and the 90s, I think China played the game, and for them it was a game, because they wanted to have access to foreign investment and foreign technology. So they felt that if they compromise and had those discussions, but try to organize them in a way that they could manage, they would benefit economically. And my conclusion is that once they reach a level of development, they started to make life difficult, to the point where, in the case of Canada, we came to the conclusion that it was not worth to pursue those human rights dialogue, because we were going nowhere. That, in fact, when we had delegations coming to discuss the subject, they could only meet with people at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And so when I arrived in Beijing in 2012, and I spoke with my colleagues from other embassies who still had those human rights dialogue, I asked them, well, how is it going? And they were all very frustrated, because in fact, the Chinese were no longer listening, and they were getting aggressive, and so it was not going. I say this because we have to use any issue that can be used as leverage to try to extract something from China. And on this, it's better if you work as a group, because if you want to go as an individual country, and Canada is perceived as a small country by China, and it's very difficult on our own. And in fact, in the present situation, it would be impossible. But I would say that there is one lever that could be used, and this applies also. I've said this publicly. It could be applied to Xinjiang, because Xinjiang now is going through what, in my view, Tibet has been going for some time. The lever is the Winter Olympics that are going to take place in Beijing in February of next year. This is a matter of national pride. Xi Jinping wants to have foreign leaders to come to the opening ceremony, and make a big show. Well, I think, Western countries should get together and tell China, we won't go to the Olympics unless you agree. And it's a matter of deciding how long a list of subjects do you want to give to China. We would have to see how China would react. Of course, China feels that they say internal matters, and they don't want to be lectured on that. The other angle that can be used is what are the covenants that China has signed under the United Nations, covenants related to human rights. And this is an area that we use, when we would be able to have a minister come, we would prepare talking points, say, from what we know, what's going on in Tibet, we feel that this is in contravention of this covenant that you, China, have signed. You have a legal obligation to meet the criteria in this covenant. Also, we would use the Chinese constitution and Chinese laws to say, when we're aware of some specific cases, we would say, this contravene this law. Can you explain to us how this is possible? And of course, the Chinese officials would get very angry when we would raise this, because if they say that they are a country governed by the rule of law, well, and if you say, well, yeah, there's a law, but you don't care about the law, you do anything you want and you contravene your own law. So I think that it's a matter of trying to have a systematic approach using leverages, but getting together. And in this, I have great hopes that this new Council of Democracies or Union of Democracies or Alliance of Democracies, I've seen various names that President Biden has launched. The first meeting is supposed to take place in April. I would hope that this forum be used to agree on common strategies, common positions, to force China to open up and to be more accountable. And because China has been very successful at dividing countries, and the Chinese proverb, you kill the monkey to scare the you kill the chicken to scare the monkey. Well, they do that. They have done that to Canada. They have done that to Australia, to other countries. So if you dare to criticizing them on one subject, they will punish you very severely and give you as an example to other countries, and with the message, if you want to criticize us, watch out. We will do to you what we are doing to Canada or other countries. And we have to stop that and react with common positions and make them pay a price. And the message, I've said this publicly, the message to China should be very simple. We have no problem with you being a superpower and all this, but you have to abide by international treaties that you sign, and you have to respect religious freedom, freedom of expression, and this is the expectation. I'm not sure that we will that will make much inroads, because in fact, what we have seen since Xi Jinping became president of China, in fact, since he became Secretary General of the Communist Party of China, because this is a more important position than being president. I'm convinced that China doesn't care now about the reputation of China, because he thinks that all foreign countries depend too much on China, that nobody will dare to criticize them. And so that's why this new Council of Democracies, in my view, could play a useful role. And the other thing maybe, but that would take political courage, maybe, Western leaders would say, well, you know what, we are going to, all of us will take turn to meet with the Dalai Lama. That would really upset the Chinese. But, if, I think the challenge for Western governments, and I've said this again publicly, we have learned a lot more in the last year, the last 2 years, about what's really going on in China, especially in Xinjiang. But again, in a way, I've said this also to some people, the spotlight has moved from Tibet to Xinjiang, but let's not forget about Tibet, because there are also awful things that are going on there. But it has become, now that we know a lot more about what's going on internally in China, I think it has become a lot more difficult for Western countries to give the benefit of the doubt to China. I think that history will judge us very severely if we are not more forceful in our interventions with China.
Thank you. Next, we have Edwina.
Thank you. More on your lever to push the Winter Olympics. I'm just wondering if you have any suggestions or recommendations of what Canadian levers of power that an individual could push to get either the Winter Olympics in Beijing boycotted or moved.
Yes. Well, I know this is a very difficult topic for the federal government. And of course, we have it's the worst phase of bilateral relations that we have had with China. We have the 2 Canadians. We have 4 other Canadians who are on death row. And of course, there's a lobby also that wants to continue to do business, and they want to make money, and so they try to hamper discussion of those subjects. But again, in my view, the Olympics, the Winter Olympics, give a very good lever that we should use to force the Chinese government to change its course of action. And what should be done, there should be an ultimatum given to the Chinese government and say, if you don't allow an independent investigation to take place very rapidly, and we could say in Xinjiang, in Tibet, well, we will push the International Olympic Committee to move the games. And I think, it would not be fair for the athletes to cancel the games. And then for this to move the games, you need Plan B. Plan B, in my view, would be you need to organize the games in a country that has already organized the games. And I would say that our closest partner is the United States. Why don't we agree to jointly host the Winter Olympics? It could be, part of the games could be in Seattle, part in Vancouver and Whistler or Calgary, or it could be in Lake Placid if we want to have it in Eastern Canada, in Lake Placid, Montreal, and Quebec City. So, and you say, and for that, and then, we will still be dealing with COVID, I'm afraid, and we say we'll postpone the game by 1 year to February 2023. And we will host, and the government, we have just spent billions of dollars on COVID. We put 1 or 2 billion to help cities to organize. We use existing facilities. And I think for Canadians, if letter campaigns could be organized where, and you use some of the arguments I've made publicly, now that we know what's going on in China, how will history judge us? And it's genocide that is taking place. Now that we know, we have to take action. And by the way, Canada in the past had very successful campaigns. Brian Mulroney launched a campaign on apartheid in South Africa, and that led to the dismantle apartheid. So you have to start moving. Of course, China is a huge country, but at the same time, people forget that China is not monolithic, that there are factions in the Communist Party there are academics that criticize Xi Jinping. And if we take forceful actions, if we are much firmer in how we deal with China, it will encourage those, what I would call progressist forces in China to try to move the dialogue and force a debate about the direction where China is going. You know, many people are critical, but so I think that's why, you know, maybe it's idealistic, but again, it's a question is once you know what's going on, you have to react.
Ambassador, we have next Dechen from SFT Canada with a question.
Thank you, Sharpla, and thanks to the ambassador for answering our questions. I just have a question. I'm curious to hear your thoughts. I think my question is, what should Canada's stance towards China be? And I'm asking this with the context of course, you know, the world knows what's going on in Hong Kong right now, what's going on in Xinjiang. You know, Tibet was recently listed as the least free country in the world, according to Freedom House, and we also have, you know, 2 Canadians in China right now imprisoned as retaliation for what's happening or Meng's arrest, right? And I know I recently read one of your articles in engaging with China selectively. You know, you had said about finding common goals to work towards with China, and I'm wondering, how can I guess like a country, when we don't see kind of hope from China for following international norms and standards, how can we begin to engage, you know, when China has total lack of disregard for international norms, basic fundamental human rights, and so I kind of want to hear your thoughts on what should Canada's stance be.
Yeah, well, I think that it took a while for politicians in Canada to understand what I've called the new China. And the new China is aggressive, assertive, and there are a lot more problems in relation to freedom of religion, human rights, freedom of expression. And maybe it was naivety on the part of the government to think that, you know, if we were to engage with China on the economic side, that they would be exposed to our way of doing things, that things would open. And I think maybe in the late 90s, I couldn't understand why we were thinking this, because China was experimenting with local elections, and Zhu Rongji, who was the premier at the time, was compromising, and you know, he wanted China to be allowed to get into the World Trade Organization. So maybe it was all a sham, but since then, I think you know, we have learned a lot more about hostage diplomacy or using trade as a weapon. You know, Australia is the latest recipient of that because the Australian Prime Minister has dared to call for an investigation of the COVID, the start of the COVID pandemic in China, and China has punished Australia. And you know, I know that there was a debate in Ottawa. There was a paper prepared by Global Affairs that was discussed among departments. But my understanding is that the office of the Prime Minister has stopped that, because you will recall that the previous Foreign Affairs Minister, Mr. Champagne, had said in late fall that you know, they were working on a revised engagement strategy with China. And I was encouraged by this. And by revised engagement strategy, my understanding of this is, let's stop being nice with China and having collaboration on sectors where they benefit, and let's be a lot more restrictive. And the message should be, the engagement with you, China, will be very limited to areas where, and I think we cannot ignore China. China is too important, and there are issues like nuclear proliferation, where we have to engage with China. Also on climate change, because pollution travels, and if we can help them to reduce their emission of greenhouse gases, we will benefit also. So there are areas, in my view, and that's what I have advocated in this article, that we should continue to engage. But overall, and the same thing for trade, people are saying, well, we cannot be too critical of China because they will cancel our exports. Well, look at the trade result for last year. In fact, our exports to China increased by 8% compared to 2019. Why is that? Well, on the agricultural front, they have had problems. So they needed to buy canola seeds, canola oil, swine from Canada. And so I think we should not be afraid of losing markets, because they will need our products. But we should be a lot more selective for selling products or engaging in collaboration in subjects like artificial intelligence or high technology, in case this is used to increase controls in China. There was one case of a company, a Quebec company, that was selling parts for cameras that were then used for control purposes in China. So I think that the federal government has to be a lot more make sure that you don't get products that are made in labor camps in Xinjiang. I have to do a lot more than that, because of course these companies, if they ask their Chinese suppliers, is this coming from Xinjiang? Is this using forced labor? The answer will be no. And so we have all this to say that we have to look at China in a lot more critical way. And if we do this in good company with other countries, I think that China at some point will see that there is a price that they will pay. And they need trade for to continue with their growth. 19% of the Chinese GDP comes from exports. And so some people say, well, we need to be nice to China to, well, China also needs trade. And so I think we can be a lot more forceful, but we have to, it requires a full discussion on what this engagement strategy should be. But the dilemma for the government also is, well, there are lots of bad guys in the world, and in my view, well, you need a consistent approach, because you cannot decide to be tough on a small country that is not very significant, and then let this big monster China to do whatever it wants. And so, but again, maybe I'm idealistic, but if you work with like-minded countries, hopefully we'll be able to make progress.
Ambassador, we have a question from CTC board member Louisa. But with that, I wanted to ask Ambassador, how many more questions you could answer?
Well, I have about 15 minutes.
Okay, so. Thank you. Okay. Yes, Louisa, please go ahead.
Great. Thank you, Ambassador. Merci beaucoup. It's really appreciated hearing your insights about your visit. I had two questions, actually. And as you mentioned apartheid in South Africa, I couldn't help but think about places like East Timor. And, in the situation in East Timor and the government stance on East Timor. And about how, for example, in Indonesia too, for so many years, it was so contentious for so many reasons. I'm wondering, are there things that the Canadian government can learn from those type of situations in terms of the stance that on how to go forward in dialoguing with China or in dealing with China. And the second question is more about CTC. CTC is a national advocacy organization promoting the human rights and freedoms of Tibetan people. In your opinion, you mentioned some ideas already about possible angles, about maybe focusing on the Olympics. Are there other ideas you would have based on your experience of maybe where we could focus on that would be really important? For example, is it worth pushing the Sino-Tibetan dialogue? Is it better perhaps to focus other places where we might be able to leverage more and maybe gain more terrain in some ways rather than focusing on that? So I'd love to hear your opinion on, based on your experience on those things.
Mm-hmm. Well, on your first question, obviously, there are a number of people in government or former government officials, former diplomats, who could be tasked with doing an exercise on lessons learned. How have we dealt with other trouble spots or problems in the past? What worked, what did not work? And I think that this could produce interesting report. This being said, one avenue that was used in the past, the United Nations Human Rights Council, now has become a lot more difficult to use because China has taken control of that council, and I've watched this over the years with the development assistance that China is providing, and with the assistance through the Belt and Road Initiative. They are forcing a number of developing countries to side with them. They have no choice. These countries know that if they dare to criticize China, the development assistance will be cut. And the Chinese don't put conditions as severe as Western countries would do. But still, I think it would be a useful exercise to see what are the lessons learned in terms of the CTC and how to try. I think if you can publicize more the human angle, and the human misery that result from the actions of China in Tibet. Also, we didn't discuss this, but I know that one of the tactics used by the Chinese government is to put pressure on Tibetans abroad who have family, who still have family in Tibet, to stop them from criticizing. Well, any such cases of interference should be publicized, should be reported to Canadian authorities, and we have to be a lot more forceful to stop that interference. I consider this as interference in Canadian affairs. But if you could find ways to publicize, I think that Canadians, the Canadian public, react to this. If a Tibetan was just trying to go his or her own way in life and living a simple life, but then ran into trouble because he or she had a picture of the Dalai Lama, or and when was sent to a camp or was tortured, I think this could generate more interest on the part of Canadian media and Canadian people, and then hopefully that would put pressure on the government to try to come up with some new ideas. But it's always the starting point should always be to say, well, let's put ourselves in the shoes of the Chinese and try to think, what are the vulnerable points? The issue of pride and faith is always very important, but is there a way where we could make them lose face? And so also with Tibet, the issue of religion is a very important one, and we know that the Chinese government is focusing on the period after the Dalai Lama. The Dalai Lama, of course, is getting older, and they will want to control the process. And I think, again, this, if a kind of strategy could be thought through about how to use this to prevent China from, I'm sorry that I don't have more concrete ideas, but I think we have to try to find ways. But in my view, what works is when there is a human angle.
Thank you, Ambassador. That was very helpful. We'll certainly consider the advice on campaign strategies and insights. Next, we have just two more questions, Ambassador. We have Sini Wongela, the president of the Tibetan Cultural Center in Toronto.
Thank you, Sharabla. Thank you, Ambassador, for taking the time today and sharing your experience back in Tibet. Very insightful, listening so far. I wanted to ask about your experience. I'm more leaning towards in terms of language. I mean, language is so important for to have basically a culture alive. So first of all, I wanted to understand when you visited Lhasa and Shigatse, in terms of especially you mentioned about going to a university. We hear that China's removing the language from a lot of the schools. And at the same time, we hear that when you go out on the streets of Lhasa, all the shops and now it's all in Chinese. We don't see much of the Tibetan text anymore. So I know the Canadian government has granted some funds to the Tibetan government in exile, the Central Tibetan Administration, to try and especially for women and girls on the education side. What can the Canadian government do in order to restore those Tibetan schools back in Tibet, or trying to bring the language, add more language classes, as well as in terms of culture as well, like all the songs and dances, and that's all what we actually celebrate, right, when we talk about culture. So I know on the political side, you shared a lot of your experience, and there are some organizations, local organizations here, in Canada, that are trying to actually open up schools back in Tibet, and especially in the remote areas. But I would want to hear like your opinion on what we could do as an organizations here, or as Canada as a country as a whole.
A difficult one, and I have seen a shift in the policy of the Chinese government with regard to minority, because I recall when I went to China the first time on my first posting in Beijing in 1984. On the you have the on the Avenue of Eternal Peace, you have the Minority Exhibition Center. And at that time, I recall, buying books for my children that depicted the life of minorities in China. And there was more promotion of languages and all this. It seems like, I would say, there was a turning point that occurred maybe about 10 years ago, maybe a bit more than that, where they decided that assimilation was a better way to force minorities. And now it's not only Tibetan language education, it's also Mongolian language education, it's Uyghur language. It's like if they say we will force these people to learn Mandarin, and everything will be in Mandarin everywhere, and culture will be reduced to just folkloric aspects like dance in areas that are not threatening to the Communist Party of China. And this is a major shift, you know, when and it takes various forms. And also let's recall that with minorities were not subject to the one-child policy. Well, now it's controls in place, severe controls to force abortions, to sterilization program, you know, abortions, all this. And so there, and a deliberate and organized attempt to assimilate minorities, to limit their rights, to force them to work in Mandarin, and you know, all this put together is very worrisome. I recall, you know, having discussion with the Communist Party of China on the situation in minority areas in China. And my interlocutor said, how would you react if we were advocating for the Quebec independence? And I said, no, I'm not advocating for the independence of Xinjiang. I'm not advocating for the independence of Tibet. But I said, here I am, a French Canadian ambassador in our second most important missions abroad. I said, how many Tibetan ambassadors do you have? How many Uyghur ambassadors do you have? And I said, you have to understand that it's possible to protect minority rights and let those minorities have their culture, their language, while at the same time, you know, integrating them in the national fabric. And I said, you should look at the example of Canada, and we would be happy to discuss how we did it with our multicultural policies. Well, that official became very angry with me, but you know, I think that, you know, Canada is a great example, and but, you know, I think my question was legitimate. You don't see Tibetan ambassadors, you know, when I mentioned that, he looked at me like this, you know, this was the most awful thing that he had ever heard. But again, you know, if they wanted really to avoid creating for themselves long-term problems, they have to be, they would have to do a complete reevaluation of their policies towards minorities. But I agree with you that, in fact, what is happening in China now is very worrisome.
I think we passed just one last, we have Ray. Ray, please, quickly.
Sorry, let me unmute myself. Thank you, Ambassador, for your detailed accounting of your that and for speaking very publicly on behalf of Canadians for some of the punishing behavior that China's been doing lately, particularly stopping our imports in retaliation for the arrest of the Huawei leader. Mike, I just have a quick comment that CTC members, I've been a Canada-Tibet Community Board member for quite a number of years and an active member. And it's been very difficult to watch, I guess, to think through what our own strategy should be, as we tend to be a moderate organization that supports the Tibetan government's stance on the middle way approach and accepting the one country, two systems philosophy. But certainly after the last couple of years, watching the crackdowns in Hong Kong, the whole world, including Taiwan and Tibetans, are rethinking, you know, Why are we even entertaining this thought of one country, two systems? And as a moderate organization like CTC, we're now left questioning this more moderate approach. I think that's been a real challenge. That's continued to be a real challenge for us with what's happened in the last year. But I have a more specific question that you've really touched on a number of times in different ways, and that's reciprocal access. You mentioned in your accounting of your visit that you said to one of your minders, well, if you came to Canada, you would be allowed to investigate whatever you want and travel anywhere and talk to anyone. Why can't I have that? And same with other diplomats, same with our press, and even on another level, the same with our Tibetan friends. How easily can they go visit Tibet and see their families? How easily can Tibetans come to Canada and just travel? So and that would open up so many interesting opportunities, including exposing the abuses that are really going on in Tibet. So, and who knows, right? With all this interaction, there could be moments that some major abuses are able to be videoed and then put on social media. And as we all know by now, amazing things can happen when you have, I'll call it, the George Floyd moment, when the world can see with their own eyes what's really going on. But China so tightly controls everything that
running out of time, Ray.
yeah, just all their claims about what's going on in Xinjiang, nobody can prove otherwise. So do you think do you have any suggestions for trying to get reciprocal access on any level between the rest of the world in Tibet and China and Tibet and Canada and Tibet?
Yeah, well, I would say that, we have, when I have been advocating publicly that we need to be much firmer, and I've said we should apply reciprocity. Well, this is an example. We don't have access there, then we put limits on. And I think we have been too nice. Canadians are very nice by nature. I think we have to be tougher. Of course, I was listening to you. You have to keep in mind that the Chinese leadership sees Tibet as a strategic area, especially with the long border with India. And it's also strategic because of the access and because of water, because it feeds, a good part of the water in China comes from Tibet. And so for all those reasons, they see Tibet as theirs. And so it's something that we won't be able to change our mind, but I think we have to find ways to say, well, this could continue, but you have to be more respectful. But again, I think it's a question of holding them to account, trying to apply reciprocity, try to be creative. I can understand that you are getting frustrated with a moderate approach because they have come to the conclusion that with a moderate approach, they will over time be able to reduce and narrow your approach, and at some point, and with the policies that they are putting in place and implementing, their hope is that after maybe 15, 20 years, the problem will be solved from their perspective.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much, Ambassador, for your patience, because we passed our time, and thank you to all the participants. I think we will take a lot of learnings from these discussions. Canada is certainly, I think, a good example of what could really happen if a genuine autonomy is implemented in a country like Tibet. And also, Ambassador, this month, March, marks the 62 years since the Tibetan National Uprising Day, when thousands of Tibetans were killed in March 1959. So I think this was a good discussion to reflect on Ambassador's experience of visiting Tibet, and also to get us some advice on what could be a real strategies in terms of countering China's rising influence and repressions in Tibet, in Xinjiang, East Turkestan, in Hong Kong, and elsewhere. Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you so much for taking your time. And thank you to all the meeting participants.
Well, thank you for the invitation, and good luck with your efforts. I know it's a difficult issue, but good luck.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.